What if I told you that a missing comma cost a company $5 million? Not a decimal point, not a zero, a comma. 3 milk truck drivers in Maine sued their employer for 4 years of unpaid overtime. They won. And the reason they won wasn't because of hours worked or pay stubs or witness testimony. It was because of a grammatical choice made by someone in the Maine state legislature who probably never imagined their sentence structure would end up in federal court. This is the story of how punctuation became a weapon, how a dairy company lost millions because someone forgot to type one keystroke, and how the entire legal world had to reckon with a question most of us haven't thought about since 8th grade English class: does the Oxford comma matter? Spoiler, it does. And it cost Oakhurst Dairy more than most people make in a lifetime. Let's go back to 2014, Portland, Maine. Oakhurst Dairy is a regional institution, one of those family-owned companies that's been delivering milk to New England doorsteps since 1921. Think glass bottles, local roots, the whole Norman Rockwell aesthetic. They employ about 200 people, most of them drivers who haul dairy products across the state in refrigerated trucks. The drivers work long hours, pre-dawn starts, weekend shifts, holidays. But they're not getting overtime pay, time and a half after 40 hours, even though they're routinely working 50, 60, 70 hours a week. Why? Because Oakhurst Dairy claims they're exempt. Under Maine labor law, certain agricultural and food distribution workers don't qualify for overtime. Oakhurst says their drivers fall into that category. The drivers disagree. Enter the lawyers. Specifically, a guy named David Webert, a labor attorney who's been fighting wage theft cases in Maine for decades. He looks at the law. He looks at the drivers' schedules. And then he notices something. A missing comma. Here's where it gets technical. But stay with me because this is where the case is won or lost. Maine's overtime law has a list of exemptions. Jobs that don't qualify for overtime pay. The specific exemption Oakhurst Dairy is using reads like this: the canning, processing, preserving, freezing, drying, marketing, storing, packing for shipment or distribution of 1. Agricultural produce, 2. Meat and fish products, and 3. Perishable foods. Now, at first glance, that looks straightforward. It's a list of activities. If you do one of those activities, you're exempt from overtime. But here's the problem. What exactly does packing for shipment or distribution mean? Is it? Option A, packing for shipment and distribution, 2 separate activities, or is it? Option B, packing for the purpose of shipment or distribution, 1 combined activity. If it's option A, then drivers who distribute products but don't actually pack them should be getting overtime. They're not on that exempt list. If it's option B, then drivers are exempt, because distribution is part of the packing process. The difference between those two interpretations? A comma. If the law had been written with an Oxford comma, also called a serial comma, it would have read packing for shipment or distribution. That extra comma would make it crystal clear that distribution is a separate item on the list. But there's no comma. And because there's no comma, the sentence is ambiguous. Now you might be thinking this is insane. This is a legal loophole based on grammar rules from middle school. And you'd be right. But here's the thing. Ambiguity in legal language is a gift to lawyers. Because when the law is unclear, courts apply a principle called the rule of lenity. It means when the statute can be read 2 different ways, the interpretation that favors the worker or the defendant wins. In this case, the drivers win. Oakhurst Dairy doesn't take this lying down. They fight back hard. Their argument is simple. We've been interpreting the law this way for decades. Our drivers deliver dairy products. That's distribution. The exemption applies. End of story. They hire lawyers. They file motions. They argue that the legislative history shows the exemption was meant to include distribution workers. They point to other states' laws. They bring in grammar experts, yes, actual grammar experts, to testify about sentence structure and punctuation norms in legal drafting. But the driver's attorney, David Webert, has a counter-argument that's almost beautiful in its simplicity. If the state of Maine wanted to exempt distribution workers from overtime, they should have written it clearly. They didn't. That's not our problem. The case goes to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. 3 federal judges have to decide. Does the missing Oxford comma create enough ambiguity to rule in favor of the drivers? The stakes are massive. If Oakhurst loses, they owe back pay to drivers going back years. We're talking about dozens of employees, thousands of hours, compounding interest. And it's not just Oakhurst on the line. Every dairy distributor, every food processing company, every agricultural employer in Maine is watching, because if the drivers win, the floodgates open. The oral arguments are surreal. Federal judges are debating grammar. One judge asks, should we be consulting Strunk and White or the Blue Book? Another jokes, I never thought I'd have to revisit my freshman composition class. But beneath the levity, there's a real tension. Because this isn't really about commas, it's about power. It's about whether employers can hide behind unclear language to avoid paying workers what they're owed. March 2017. The First Circuit Court of Appeals issues its ruling. The drivers win. The court's reasoning is blunt. The exemption is ambiguous. The missing Oxford comma makes it unclear whether distribution is a separate exempt activity or part of packing for shipment. And because it's ambiguous, the rule of lenity applies. The law must be read in favor of the workers. Oakhurst Dairy is on the hook for back pay. Lots of it. In February 2018, the case settles. Oakhurst agrees to pay $5 million to the drivers. But the fallout doesn't stop there. Within months, the Maine legislature scrambles to rewrite the overtime exemption law. The new version? It includes the Oxford comma, and it explicitly lists distribution as a separate exempt activity. No ambiguity, no loopholes. The case becomes a national sensation. Grammar nerds rejoice. The AP style book, which doesn't use the Oxford comma, starts getting defensive. Legal drafters across the country begin auditing their contracts, terrified that a missing comma might be the next multi-million-dollar lawsuit. And here's the kicker. This case didn't just change Maine law, it became precedent. Courts across the country now cite O'Connor versus Oakhurst Dairy when interpreting ambiguous statutes. Law schools teach it in contract drafting courses. Corporate lawyers live in fear of it. All because someone forgot a comma. So what's the lesson here? It's not just use the Oxford comma, although seriously, use the Oxford comma. The real lesson is this. Language is power. And the people who control language, who write the laws, draft the contracts, set the terms, have an obligation to be clear. Because when language is vague, when a sentence can be read 2 different ways, the people with the least power are the ones who suffer. Workers lose wages. Consumers get scammed. The fine print becomes a weapon. And that's what makes this case so perfect. It's not just about grammar. It's about accountability. It's about forcing the people who write the rules to actually think about what those rules mean. Oakhurst Dairy could have avoided this entire mess if someone in Maine's legislature had added 1 keystroke, 1 comma. But they didn't. And it cost them $5 million. So the next time someone tells you that punctuation doesn't matter, that the boring stuff in contracts doesn't matter, that you don't need to read the fine print, remember this story. Remember the milk truck drivers who won 4 years of back pay because of a missing comma. And remember, in the law, every word matters. Every comma matters. Every keystroke matters. Because somewhere right now there's a sentence being written that's going to end up in court. And the person writing it better hope they use the right punctuation.